Well, welcome everybody who's online so far. We're going to give a couple more minutes to let folks continue to join here, and then we'll plan on getting started in 2 minutes. Okay, we're at 2 minutes after, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our 2020 Standard Scenarios Report webinar. And I kind of feel like that it just started snowing at my house, so I was like I should be playing Winter Wonderland background music or something while you're waiting for us to start, but we missed that, so you'll have to just hum in your head or something instead. But welcome, it's good to have you today. So Wesley Cole, my name's Wesley Cole. I'm here with Peter Gagnon to talk about the 2020 Standard Scenarios Report. This is an annual product produced by us at NREL. This is our 6th year we've done this, so some of you I think will be pretty familiar with this. Others, this is a newer thing, so we'll spend just a little bit of time up front getting up to speed with what these things are and reminding other folks who maybe haven't taken a look at this in a while, and then dive into what's there. There's a lot of new content this year we're pretty excited about, so we think there's a lot of interesting pieces here. Before we start, want to just let you know that this is being recorded. We're planning on making it available afterwards, both the slides and the recording. Anytime along the way, if you have questions, throw them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. We'll look forward to engage with you as we go through this. So another piece I want to acknowledge here, our project team is listed. There's a lot of folks who were involved in this, so these people were directly engaged in helping us produce the work you're going to see here. And then just there's a wider group of people who support other ancillary pieces of this. So we just want to acknowledge that this is, even though me and Peter are presenting, there's a lot of folks who've done a lot of great work here to make this happen. So let's go ahead and get started then. So we're going to start just basic, what are the standard scenarios? Let's start there. So I've got listed here tables, nice colors, hopefully pretty for you. The suite of forward-looking, so these are the scenarios, the suite of forward-looking scenarios that we produce as part of the standard scenarios. So this year we have 45 scenarios. Every year we have a few different, most of the scenarios stay the same from year to year, but we'll add new ones or take some away. So for example, this year we have a high electrification scenario that's new because the electrification futures work that's been happening with NREL is wrapping up, and we're able to roll those high electrification scenarios into our work. So the standard scenarios are just it's this range of forward-looking scenarios or projections of the U.S. electricity sector that help inform decision making. This is also an important piece here is that the standard scenarios is a companion product of the annual technology baseline, or the ATB. This annual technology baseline is a set of cost and performance assumptions that are projected out through 2050. So you'll see the green box here in the middle is it's the biggest one. This is a whole bunch of technology cost and performance scenarios, those all come from the annual technology baseline. So, what happens in a low PV cost future? What happens in a future where wind gets cheaper? Those come out of there. Those are developed as part of the ATB, and then the standard scenarios is where we start to exercise those projections to see how they would influence the electricity sector. We used to release them together. We separated them just for convenience, but they're still tied in that way. Okay, so this is what they are. So why do we use them? Why do we do this? Well, there's a lot of reasons. I've summarized some of them here. So first is that the data and tools are very convenient both for us and for other people to have something that's already run, that's already been vetted, that we could just pull off the shelf and do analysis. So it greatly accelerates a lot of our analysis because we've already spent a lot of time figuring out what assumptions should be, what makes sense, how the tool should be operated. And then part of the standard scenarios is making all these things available. So both the data that you'll be seeing is all made public, and then the tools we've made public as much as we're able so that people can open them up or use them themselves or do what they want with them. We also really value transparency here. We want people to know what we assume when we're making these projections, why we're getting the answers that we get, and make it so people could really scrutinize what's going on. We want to try, our goal is to be very objective in our work, and so we want to be transparent so people could see what's going on behind the scenes. And then finally, it's a forum for us to help facilitate and communicate ideas to improve decision-making, to improve communication among different stakeholder groups in terms of understanding how the power sector can evolve over time. So how does this work? How does this process work? Well, we start with our scenario definitions. We showed you that table with all the different scenarios. So if we're going to run the low PV cost scenario, all those pieces that define the scenario, we start there, and then we feed them into 3 different models. So we're using the DGen model, which is a rooftop PV adoption model. It works off of Bass diffusion to project adoption. And then we use the Reads capacity expansion model, which minimizes total system costs and projects of the evolution of the bulk power system, and then finally Plexo's production cost model, which minimizes the cost of just operating the system, but does it at a much higher temporal resolution. And these models all interact with each other. So the DGen model uses electricity prices from Reads to do its rooftop PV adoption, and then feeds those rooftop PV adoption projections back into Reads, where Reads builds out the rest of the system. And then once we have a Reads system built out, then that's fed into Plexos, where we could do the production cost modeling at a much higher resolution than Reads is able to do. And then all these things are then pulled together into our Cambium output processing, which Peter's going to talk about later, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. And then finally, wrapped up into the results that we make public. And I'm going to pause here before I keep going. Peter, my screen just told me I have a network error, and I'm not seeing anybody else on the call anymore. So I just want to make sure you could still see my screen. It's still working. If not, we might want to switch over to you.
I cannot see your screen. I'm getting a little error that says due to low bandwidth something. I can still hear you fine, but I can't see your screen. So I could start sharing if it seems like that.
Yeah, let's try that. So Isabel, do you want to switch over to Peter sharing the screen, and we'll do that? Otherwise, I'll still go through the rest of this, but it's more fun when you can see the things that are going on here.
Isabel, can you hear us?
Yes. Are you guys back?
Yeah, can you switch over to Peter sharing screen? Looks like my network's not working to be able to do the screen share the rest of the way here.
Sure. Yeah, let's try that again. Thanks everyone for your patience. All right, Peter, I'm passing presenter privileges over to you.
Sorry for everyone on the call. I'm afraid I'm not seeing anything yet.
Virtual.
This would be unfortunate if we both have them at the same time.
Yeah. Peter, do you see at the bottom the ability to share content?
No, it's still grayed out.
One more time. Presenter.
I will say that I have a little thing in the upper right-hand corner that says automatically reconnecting. I'm a little bit concerned that whatever the problem is just not with Wes and I's internet, but something else.
Well, this could be fun. We get in.
Okay, I now have the ability to share. Again, my my apologies, everyone. Hopefully this can, Isabel, can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
I got remuted in that. So, Peter, you're going to go to slide 5.
Okay. I'm on slide 5 now.
Okay, and you could click through until you see the DGen and Reads links come up.
Okay.
So
right.
This is what I was just talking through that you may not have been able to see. You could just keep going through until you see the web links come up for DGen and Reads pop up. Perfect. Okay, so thanks everybody. That looks like that was I just got a note. It looks like that was an NREL network outage. So apologies for that. It just it looks like it just pulled us all down for a minute. Okay, now you can see what I just talked through after we got back up and running. Just want to note that both the Reads and DGen models are NREL models, so we've made both of those publicly available. You could get them at the link shown here, and Plexos is not our model, so we try and make as much data as available as we can, but we don't own it, so we can't make it any more available than what it is right now. So let's go to the next slide. So we've said we do this every year. The standard scenarios work. So what's different this year? First piece is that we made a lot of changes in terms of model updates. So there's a lot different in this year's model versus last year's. Some of the key pieces are noted here. One, we've added an hourly module that could better represent all the hourly behavior of storage and renewable energy and all those pieces that are going on, so we get much higher resolution there. We also have incorporated multiple years of weather data so that you could capture making sure you're building out a system that's resource adequate across lots of different weather conditions. So we used to only look at one weather year. Now we're looking at 7 weather years, so making sure the system could operate well across all those 7 years. Prior to other updates, the model now does its own retirement decisions. Before we just did lifetime retirements. We've added the electrification. There's a lot of changes. There's a table in the report that's got all of them, so I'll point you there if you're interested in these kind of things. So you want to click again. We'll get to the outputs are significantly expanded this year. So we've updated our scenario viewer and we've added hourly results from this Cambium capability. Peter's going to talk about those, so I won't go into more detail here, but that's a pretty substantial difference this year in terms of the magnitude of outputs that are out there and the resolution of the outputs. And then finally, one more click here, Peter. The report this year is shorter than it has been in the past. We didn't do as much analysis within the report this year. We focused more just on the results and the scenario assumptions. We are going to have a follow-on analysis that's in a separate paper. So that's kind of what's different this year. So now let's talk about just the report and what's in it. I just want to highlight a few things. I go ahead and go next slide. So everything is built around this mid-case scenarios, our reference scenario. This isn't necessarily our most likely scenario, but it's the one that uses all of the kind of default reference mid-level assumptions. So I've highlighted some of those here in terms of demand growth and fuel prices that go into the model. And go ahead and go to the next slide. And when you put all those things in, you get something that looks like this. This is the U.S. power sector evolution through 2050 using those default mid-case assumptions. So you could see this is basically what the model is doing. It's saying, okay, here's what we anticipate the fuel cost and the capital costs and of all these different resources are. Here's how, what is the resource quality of wind and PV in different areas, where's the transmission, how much does it cost to build new transmission. All those things come in here together, and the model says, okay, here's the way you can meet all the requirements of policy and of meeting demand and everything else out through 2050, and here's the least cost system that will do that. So that's what the model is doing as it makes this projection over time. And so this is what comes out. We've kind of aggregated things here. There's a lot more resolution in terms of regional specificity and technology types than what's here, but for convenience, I've aggregated those. But generally, you see a system evolving today of about 20% renewable energy out to a system in 2050 that's approximately 55% renewable energy on a generation basis. But again, this is just one scenario of many. That's why we look at many scenarios, is because this is one way the system could evolve, but we want to look at many other ways that it might evolve. So we go to the next slide. We just want to highlight that these results are not done. We don't treat the U.S. as one grid. We model things in detail to try and capture the different regional aspects that are happening, different regional policy considerations. So we're often reporting things at the state level and sometimes find a resolution as we put things out. So we go ahead and go to the next slide. So how does our work compare to others? That's shown here. The top row showing the renewable energy share of total generation relative to BNEF, EIA, and IEA, and their annual projections. Not all the 2020 projections were out when we were doing this. They've since come out, but they were a little bit later in the year, so we weren't able to roll them in. But you can see how our renewable energy share compares to other projections, as well as how our power sector emissions compare to other folks in terms of how we see the future evolve relative to others. And this kind of things included in the report just to kind of give you a sense of what our work looks like relative to others. And go to the next slide. So again, we don't want to just look at one scenario. The only thing we could really say about our mid-case scenario is that it's not going to be what actually happens. Something different is going to happen than that. So just try and, in order to explore different kinds of futures, we have all of these sensitivity scenarios. We showed you these tables before. So there's 45 total scenarios, and then we start looking across those to see what happens. So if you go to the next slide, we get something that looks like this. This is our generation by fuel type across the 45 scenarios. The dashed line is the mid-case. So you can see what our that mid-case assumption looks like. You could see what all the other scenarios look like. You will see a clustering typically around the mid-case, and that's because a lot of scenarios change something. Everything changes things relative to the mid-case. So when you make a change and it doesn't have a big impact, you'll get another solution that's close to the mid-case. So that doesn't mean the mid-case is more probable. It just means that we explored more scenarios that are similar to the mid-case than otherwise. But now we could start to see how futures change in different technology types, and you could start exploring lots of different dimensions here. So next slide. There's a lot of outputs that are part of this. I just highlighted the generation piece here. You could go to the report to look at it, or to the scenario viewer that Peter's going to talk about here in a minute. There's things like, if you want to look at storage, what are the different durations of storage? What does the renewable energy penetration look like? What are the different prices coming out? What capacity credit of wind and solar technologies? What do losses look like? What does transmission builds look like? And all these other things. We put emissions here to show you what CO2 emissions look like across the suite of scenarios. So this, we're trying to provide a range of outcomes, a range of possible futures that help facilitate and enable more analysis and more effective decision making as we move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there and let Peter pick things up with the Cambium output pieces here.
Okay, thanks, Wes. So yeah, Wes is kind of giving you the broad overview of the standard scenario suite, what it looks like this year. I have the very enjoyable task of being able to focus on a very new thing that we have in this year's release, which is the project's called Cambium, for the Cambium data sets. And essentially, we put a lot of work into expanding the number of metrics that we're reporting for these future scenarios, as well as the metrics are reported at hourly resolution instead of previously it was primarily annual. So be a little bit more specific. Cambium is a public database of hourly emissions, costs, and operational metrics for the U.S. electric sector through 2050. So the first question, of course, is what's the point? Why did we do this? And why should you spend the next 15 minutes listening to me talk about what this new data set is? The first thing, I really can't emphasize how important this is. The grid is changing. If you are doing analysis or trying to analyze an intervention that is a long-lived intervention that'll last for a decade or 2 or 3 or more, and that thing interacts with the grid, then the grid will be changing underneath that thing. And in a lot of cases, it would be very good to be able to recognize the evolution of the grid for answering different types of questions. And a lot of the metrics that we have, which I'm going to give a sense of shortly, are really designed to help support different types of analysis and decision-making that somehow is impacted by this evolution of the grid. Relatedly is that some metrics that are useful for planning are inherently forward-looking. So like if you're trying to ask, if I electrify this hot water heater, used to be natural gas, what happens if I make it electric? What are the emissions induced by that change? That's an inherently forward-looking question. There are ways that you can mine historical data to have an estimate of what it looks like. But really, it's a question that says, how is this going to influence the grid going forward? So it just makes sense to have models that are trying to project the structural changes to the grid in response to the loads and the generation assets to be able to inform those decisions in ways that frankly, there haven't been necessarily metrics available to answer some very specific questions before because they require these kind of tools that we have here. And they're quite complicated to kind of derive and bring these metrics together, but they're very useful to have. And we've designed the metrics to be useful for these forward-looking decision and analysis questions. And then lastly, this is maybe more pedestrian, but there's a lot of different, for example, valuation analyses out there. Someone's trying to say, what is the value of my geothermal heat pump? But someone else's different research group is trying to say, what's the value of the energy efficiency measure that I'm considering? If everyone's drawing from different conceptions of what the grid might look like in the future, it makes it very difficult to meaningfully compare the results from those valuation exercises. We are trying to provide a public, consistently updated set of the types of inputs that you would need for those analyses so that if nothing else, you're starting from the same place when you're talking about how do these different things interact with the grid and what is their response. Trying to bring a little more consistency to how we think about valuing and talking about different types of technologies, interventions. So lots of other points, those are the main things. So Wesley already showed something like this. I just want to bring it back and make it salient. The models that we're drawing from to produce this database starts with Reads. This is the tool that we have been using for a long time now to project the evolution of the electric grid through 2050 under different types of futures. And then relatively recently, we have the capability of taking one of those grids that Reads builds and dropping it into this other tool, this commercial tool, Plexos, which then simulates the hourly operation of that future grid. So this gives us a wealth of data that's not inherently in Reads, and that is also at a hourly resolution, which Reads is not. So this was the capability that kind of allowed us to start producing this data set, and then to essentially take advantage of those capabilities. We built this tool, Cambium, that draws from both of those models and then does a bunch of post-processing and calculates new metrics that are specifically designed to be useful for certain types of decisions and analysis questions, and then builds a structured data set, which then we make available to you. That has this hourly data through 2050 that you can broadly classify the metrics as operational cost and emission metrics. So that's kind of the high-level overview. I did want to at least show you the metrics that are available in Cambium. The basically the things that you can look at. You can go and download this data, and it's a description of all this stuff for future power systems based on the standard scenarios. I'm not going to go into each one of these because there's too many. I just wanted to show you this and let it wash over you. Don't try to study any of this. This chunk here, you could broadly categorize these as operational metrics. There's different descriptions of the load and the transmission. There's stuff about distribution losses, operating reserves, a bunch of little things like that, how much curtailment is happening from wind and solar, what technologies are in the margin at each point in time. Also things like hourly generation by technology and how much of the technology there is, all that kind of stuff. This basically, this big chunk here is trying to describe in much more detail what these future energy systems look like. So you can go and get this data for our mid case in 2050 in Texas or whatever. So these are kind of the operational metrics. Another set of metrics that frankly is probably more applicable to many types of analyses is marginal costs. We report them at both the bus bar and end use level. End use is like if you're doing analyses of at the end use, so when you're consuming electricity, just like a building or something, we want to use the end use values. Whereas the bus bar is meant to say if I'm a generator operating at the bulk power, the wholesale level, and I'm injecting into the grid at that level, then I'd want to use those metrics. So we have two different values here. And then we report 4 different costs. Energy and capacity costs are the big ones. That's what most of the cost of building and operating the bulk power system come from. But then we also have 2 other costs. One we call portfolio costs. This is essentially the marginal cost of staying in compliance with renewable portfolio standards and clean energy standards if they're applicable at the point in time that you're looking at. And then we also have some information about the marginal cost of operating reserves. I am going to say that if you're interested in that, definitely look into the documentation. It doesn't, the rest of them are pretty intuitive and they map really well onto the types of questions that people want to ask. The operating reserve marginal cost is a little bit, it doesn't quite map as well onto the typical types of questions that people want to answer. So I just encourage you to look at the documentation if you're interested in operating reserves, because it might not be suitable for your purpose. The other ones are, if you have a thing in mind for the energy capacity cost, it's probably what it's probably appropriate for what you're thinking of. And then the last category is CO2 emissions. We have 5 different emission metrics that we report, 2 different average emission rates, one that ignores transmission or import and export effects, and one that includes import and export effects. And then we have 2 different marginal emission rates, the short run and the long run marginal emission rate. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in just a couple of minutes, so I'm not going to talk about those right now. Anyway, again, there's a lot of stuff. We can talk about this all day. We're not going to. I just want to say that each one of these metrics is defined, and for where appropriate, the methods behind them are documented in this document I'm showing here, the Cambium documentation. So definitely you can download this data, and then you can look at the document to get a description of what each one of these things is. We're not going to go into more detail about any of these right now, except for one. I did want to at least show you one thing to kind of give you a sense of patterns that just to give you a flavor of what you could potentially see if you downloaded this data and started using it. And for that, I wanted to show you the marginal cost trends. I got 2 different figures here. The top one is the marginal energy cost, and the bottom one is the marginal cost of capacity for the mid case in 2050. So this is like a future energy system. What is the patterns of the cost of electricity? I'm sorry if you haven't seen these heat maps before. I realize they can be hard to digest. You don't have to study this thing. For the energy, all I wanted to show you is that we have this splotch in the middle. That is relatively low-cost electricity because of solar, because of low-cost solar. At least in this particular future, 2050 has these pretty strong diurnal patterns where midday electricity is pretty cheap, and then there's a higher cost electricity at the end of the day. And then capacity, this little cluster right here of higher values is basically saying that in this particular future, under these assumptions, the costs of capacity, essentially if you consume more electricity during the evening in the summer months, that will essentially incur pretty meaningful capacity costs on the system. This is not too dissimilar from what we have right now, but the times do shift backwards over time. It gets later in the day, as well as some of the patterns shift, especially in different scenarios. Anyway, the whole point here is that we have these hourly values for a whole bunch of different systems, and you can kind of, if you want to know how your device is interacting with the system, or especially if it's dispatchable, and if you try to take advantage of some of these diurnal patterns, that's what's here. And you can download this and make use of it. I do want to specify that what we're looking at right here is just a national average, just for convenience. We do run the model at the resolution of 134. We call them balancing areas. They're sort of similar to real-world balancing areas, but they're not exactly anything. They're kind of compromised between load and resource regions and a bunch of other things. It doesn't really matter. Point is that a lot of people take these regions and then aggregate them to some other region that they're used to working with, like E-grid subregions or NERC regions or something like that. Or you can just take these 134 different regions and work directly with them. Point is, this is what the model runs at. This is what the data is available at. You can download this and make it available, or you can download it and use these 134 different regions. Also, I think Wesley mentioned this at the beginning. This full standard scenarios has 45 different scenarios. We did not run all of them for this really detailed hourly data set because that's really computationally expensive. So we only ran 5. It's a subset. There's the mid-case, low and high renewable energy costs, low battery costs, and low wind costs. It basically produces, it's by no means an exhaustive description of what the future power sector could look like, but it does cover a very good range of different renewable penetrations and behaviors of the grid under different types of penetrations of variable renewable resources. So this is what we have right now. There's going to be a lot of debate about specifically what Cambium scenarios we produce in future data releases. So this will probably be expanded at some point, but right now this is the things you can download. So I keep saying download. I did want to very quickly show you what I'm referring to with that, which is this, cambium.nrel.gov. You can go to this scenario viewer and data downloader. There's 2 different things. You can either look at a project that has all the scenarios, only has the annual data, or you can click on this, the Cambium scenarios, and this is where we have the very detailed data. It takes a little bit to load because there's quite a bit of data, but essentially this is a workspace where you can kind of explore what's in the data. We have, time series from 2020 and 2050, that kind of visualization. We also have, you can go and look at the hourly data. So here we're looking at 2050 in the mid case. What's the actual dispatch like? Where's electricity coming from? Wind, solar, natural gas, etc. And then you can change a bunch of things. It's an interactive workspace, so you can go and you can bring down whatever you want and kind of move things around. That's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to show you this is here. And then, of course, you can download the data and you get a big pile of CSVs, and then you can do whatever you want with it there. So both viewer and data downloader is available. I've got to get my screen back. Okay, so that's the main thing I wanted to just give you a sense of the metrics, what the data is. The last thing that I want to talk about is marginal emission rates that are in this data set that are now part of our standard scenarios product or delivery. And the reason why I want to draw attention to these as opposed to a lot of the other metrics is that this is the newest thing that we're producing. Everything else is pretty intuitive. Like, I think people have an understanding of what energy costs and capacity costs are and all the operational stuff. I think you people can probably look at that and intuit what we mean by that. This is relatively new, so it's worth talking about for a minute. It also plugs into a lot of analyses that if you hear, there's a decent chance that this is what you're looking for. Not everyone. In fact, I don't even know if that's true, but a lot of people ask about this metric, so I'm going to talk about it. Like I said, we have 2 different emission rates, and I'm going to define them and describe why they're different and why it's important to know the difference between the 2. The first one is the short-run marginal emission rate. This is the emission rate of the generation that would serve a change in electrical load if you keep the capital assets of the grid fixed. Nothing changes. You just go and you walk over to your hot water boiler and you turn it on. Somewhere a generator increases its generation. What's the emission rate of the generator? That's what this is. If you've thought about marginal emission rates or downloaded other data sets that just say marginal emission rate, it's almost certainly this. Typically, people are talking about the short-run value when they talk about marginal emission rates. What's super important is that this is neglecting a effect that happens when you change the load that you put on the system, either up or down. And that's why we have this other thing, which is called the long-run marginal emission rate. This is the emission rate of the generation that would serve a change in load when you take into consideration the structural changes to the grid that would be induced by a persistent change in load. That's a mouthful, but it basically means that if you're going to add or take away a load from the grid that's going to be around for at least several years, long enough where it kind of gets incorporated into the resource plans of whoever's planning the grid in your area, it will have another effect. It's not just kind of the immediate what happens with the generation. It can, for example, induce more solar to be built. And it's very important. If you neglect it, you're neglecting something, you're neglecting a very important impact of changing the load of the grid. So therefore, we calculate this metric. How we do so is in the documentation. So I'm not going to talk about that here because it's pretty wonky, but you can look it up in the documentation. Basically, the point is that if you're studying something that is a change in load that's going to be around for more than several years, it's probably appropriate to use the long-run marginal emission rate, not the short run. If you use the short run to analyze the emissions induced by electrifying a hot water heater or something like that that's going to be around for 10 or 15 years, then you're not capturing how that electrification would influence the structural evolution of the grid, which is quite important. I just wanted to show you a picture instead of just words. One of the really important aspects of this is that, again, there's this splotch in the middle of the day of lower values. This is the emission rate. The estimated emissions that would be induced by an increase in load at different points in time in the year and the hour of the day. And the splotch in the middle is during the day. And it's basically saying those values are lower because if you consume more electricity in the middle of the day, essentially it would be served by a greater proportion of solar, well, certainly than the night, which is not solar. And basically recognizing this is important if you're evaluating the emissions impact to the building. It's basically saying, or more than just a building, anything that's going to be a persistent increase in load. If you have a persistent increase in load and it consumes electricity more during the middle of the day, there is this strong diurnal pattern that if you have the analytical capabilities to incorporate this into your analysis, you'll get a better estimate of the emissions that are induced by the intervention that you're studying. And then I guess the last thing I wanted to say about this is that sometimes whatever is difference without a distinction. I just wanted to say that there's not only a difference between what these two things are, but it's a meaningful difference. The whole point of this plot, all you need to take away from this is that the short run marginal emission rate tends to be substantially greater than the long run marginal emission rate because the short run does not properly reflect how increases in load or decreases will influence the structure of the grid and therefore won't properly capture essentially the contribution of wind and solar to the future of the grid. So this is super important for answering questions like, if I electrify this thing, what are the emissions that are induced in the grid? If you use the short run marginal emission rate, you're going to get a much larger number, which is not necessarily most accurate depending on what intervention you're studying. And if it's going to be around for a long time, then you might be overestimating the emissions induced by this thing that you're studying. So it is important. Okay, so that's basically everything. The last thing I wanted to say, caveat, maybe we should add this in the beginning. Hopefully this is obvious. We just got to say this. This is simulated data, which means it can be wrong. It's not empirical data. If you go and look up, actual market operation, that's one thing. This is a different class of data, and it's just keep that in mind when you're choosing how to use this. It's not going to be appropriate for every single type of analysis because simulated data has limitations. The models that underlie the data are necessarily simplifications of reality, and therefore they can maybe not capture a relevant detail that's important for what you're trying to study. We put a lot of work into trying to say, well, what is the most important things to capture? But we can't do everything. So if you're doing something really wonky, maybe this data is not right for you. It can also just be wrong because we can make mistakes. It's models, empirical data. Well, it's real, so it doesn't have, I guess you could post-process things wrong, but you can calculate things wrong. But we could just make mistakes, and being aware of that is, of course, important. And then, of course, this is all projections of the future, so it can be wrong because we can be wrong about what the future looks like, which is why we provide a range of scenarios to try to capture that uncertainty. So just be aware of that. We have some writing about this. Go to the Cambium documentation that I showed earlier. Look to section 2. There's a brief discussion about the specific limitations of this data set that I hope will be helpful if you're trying to figure out whether or not it's right for the question that you're trying to answer. All right, that's all I've got. So questions, comments. We also have some links here for the standard scenario report, the results viewer and data downloader that I showed, as well as the documentation for Cambium. So I don't know, Wes, I can't see questions. Do you want to read those off?
I've got them. I've got them here. Yeah. So thanks, Peter. So a few questions. I start with just a couple. Well, let me start with this one. You were talking about curtailment as being one of the outputs. Could you clarify if this is just what is within the bounds of curtailment? So, for example, is curtailment from, turning off the turbines because it's migration season for birds? Is that captured in here, or is this only curtailment of a different nature?
Yeah, interesting. I've never thought about turning off the turbines for migration season. It's not explicitly that. It's essentially it's any time you could have produced electricity from a wind or solar generator, but you didn't do it for either operational reasons or economic reasons. Sometimes you curtail a little bit of energy so that you don't have to start up and shut down a big thermal generator, for example. To the extent that there is something like bird migration impacts in there, at No West, is that embedded in our capacity factor assumptions? I'm not actually, I don't know.
Yep. So in our modeling work, that's done ahead of time. It's we're going to assume the wind generation is lower because there's going to be some cold weather cutouts and there's going to be some shutdowns for environmental reasons that won't be purely economic. It's not just there's nowhere to send the power, so don't operate. Those other factors are handled upstream of what we're doing here, so that they won't be reported. So other question. Is there a way to map you talked about, the results are at these 134 regions, but you can map them to other things. Are any of those mappings provided? Specifically, this person was asking about mapping to NERC regions.
Yes. If you have go ahead and email me, peter.gagnon@nrel.gov. We have some mappings. We won't be able to provide them. At some point, we'll get them posted to a website. I frankly don't remember which ones we have right now. And if we don't have a mapping, we do have shape files of the regions, so they can be hopefully relatively easily mapped to whatever other geographies you're interested in. But if we have them, we'd make them available to you.
Okay, another question. Somebody's wondering about things like LMPs out of Plexos. You talked about marginal energy costs. Do you want to comment on how those relate or don't relate to LMPs?
Yes. So conceptually, it's very similar. I would say that it's appropriate to think of the what we call the marginal energy cost.
LMP is the locational marginal price. Sorry, I'm throwing out acronyms that I shouldn't ask in a question. Go ahead. Yes,
it's conceptually very similar to the locational marginal price. It includes, if you're familiar with the terminology used in that space. It includes the effects of both the generator short-run marginal cost, the transmission constraints, as well as losses. It has all of that together. I will say that it is definitely not a perfect replication of historical LMPs for a couple of reasons. A, the model simplification reasons that I talked about. We tend to be not that great at capturing price spikes during the really high demand times, as well as this is a least cost optimization model, so it's a little bit more optimistic than the real world and doesn't have things like bidding strategies. So it tends to not capture spikes again in the high demand periods well. So those are all kind of limitations that makes it so it's not perfect, but it does capture, it does replicate some of the diurnal trends decently. If it's super important that you are like exactly replicating LMPs, I strongly advise you to take our results and compare them against historical LMPs in the area that you're interested in and decide whether or not it's good enough, because it's not perfect, but it is conceptually equivalent and captures a lot of the trends. The magnitude's the same.
Just as a frame of reference here, so we have 134 regions in our model. In real life, there's tens of thousands of nodes where prices could be set. So once you have that higher resolution with a lot more transmission bottlenecks than we might have in our kind of aggregated transmission network, you'll get different behavior and prices. A question that's on my end of things, somebody was asking about the wide range of natural gas projections. So natural gas had the widest range of all the generator types across the 45 standard scenarios. And why is that? And what does that mean for the role of natural gas in the power sector? What's providing balancing? So just a couple of thoughts on that. One is natural gas is often a marginal generator. So as you, it shifts a lot depending on the relative economics of coal, existing coal, new natural gas, and new renewable energy. They trade off pretty strongly. So you'll have scenarios with lots of wind and solar, not as much natural gas. Or in the scenarios with the least amount of natural gas, you'll have lots of wind, solar, and storage. You'll also have lots of coal generation from the existing fleet. You'll have fewer retirements from the existing fleet. So a lot of the high natural gas scenarios are also the ones that where coal has a higher generation share for longer, and you get a lot of renewables all at the same time. So in terms of balancing in those lower natural gas generation scenarios, one is you get more coal, two is you get more storage, and three is you still will keep a lot of the natural gas capacity around. You just won't use it very much. So it's used for shorter periods when it's needed to balance out the renewable energy resources. Okay, other question. So is it, someone's asking about running a different scenario through the Cambium pipeline. So if it's like, hey, you ran these 5 scenarios, but I'm really interested in scenario X and you didn't run that one, how hard is it to do that, to run this pipeline through again for a different scenario?
Yeah, depends on the scenario, which is the most annoying answer that I could give. Some of them would be relatively straightforward. It's still again, a computationally expensive pipeline. We've got to do a lot of kind of checking and validation to make sure everything is right because this is relatively new, so we're just trying to move a little carefully. Other things that have demand side flexibility, for example, are not ready to go at this point. This is still a developing tool that we're adding onto, and then development will continue for at least next year or so. So basically, if you're really interested in something, if there's something here in these scenarios that we've run that would be very important to you that we don't have, definitely reach out, let us know. We can talk about that. It's good to know what people want. That helps our decisions of triaging what to do in the future. I will say that it's all dependent on what funding we have, of whether or not we'll be able to expand what we're reporting and have kind of different exotic futures that have elements that we're not modeling currently. Yeah, so it varies depending on exactly the scenario you want to run.
Okay, well, I've got 2 more questions, then we'll go ahead and close out. So first one, I think is pretty easy, asking about if we have natural gas demand by sector. I mean, we focused on electricity here, and at least for this work, it is very electric sector focused, and we are just reporting natural gas demand for electricity. We have some other tools that look at other sectors. Those aren't part of this work, so you're welcome to follow up, and I'm happy to connect you with people who work in those other spaces if you're interested there. And then last question I'll ask. Except I just got more questions. So I'll give you a couple more. So this will not be last question. It will be almost last question. So Peter, the emission rates, are they based on life cycle or are just on kind of the
yeah, these are just currently these are just stack emissions from combustion. Doesn't include any whatever upstream fuel effects or life cycle emissions. Nor does it include. It's not like a CO2 equivalent metric. This is very conscious. We're starting with CO2 stack emissions. We are well aware that there is a lot of interest in having these other accounting options, and we will be working on that in the future. But it is just stack emissions right now.
Okay, another question. Looking at the results and the experience of doing this work, what are some of the biggest drivers you see for the future electricity system? Do you have anything you want to? I'm happy to comment there, Peter. But if you have anything you want to throw out there, I'm happy to take it.
Yeah, I mean, policy is the biggest one, right? Is you can throw a policy that totally changes the electric grid. And then kind of a second order effect is all the different technology performance, which that's why the suite is a lot of technology, cost and performance stuff, and then policies. So kind of if you look at those kind of scenarios, I think that's a decent description of what we think is the things that change the results the most. Wes, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, just to give perspective on a couple of those and add, in the technologies, the price of producing natural gas, I think, is the other related piece, which is both a technology and a market question because it's related to other pieces. But if you look back 10 years, PV was super expensive 10 years ago, and it barely showed up in most scenarios, and now it's a major theme of almost any scenario you look at produced by anybody. Batteries were in that same bucket 5 years ago. There weren't many batteries showing up in projections, and now they're starting to show up all over the place. So technology change has been pretty dramatic. I mean, that's the same thing with natural gas prices. 10 years ago, we thought prices were going up, to above $10 per million BTU in the not too distant future. And now it's hard to find anybody who make a projection that, has them go much above $5. So there's been a lot of change in terms of the underlying economics of the pieces that are contributing to the system. So I'd say those are all pretty substantial pieces. There's a lot of unknowns in terms of how things will evolve. Things like, can you build new transmission or not? How much will that show up? Is land use going to be more of a challenge than it has been in the past for building new renewable energy? So there's a lot of outstanding questions that us and others are still working on, but it's an exciting field to be working in. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close things out. You have our email addresses here. Feel free to follow up with either one of us. We're always happy to talk about these kind of things. So if you have thoughts or questions or comments that we weren't able to get to, feel free to do that. But we'll go ahead and close things up and look forward to engaging with you down the road. So thanks, everybody.